I have recently written an article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled U.S. Targets Georgia as a Tool to Extend Russia. And this is particularly important as we see this U.S. strategy to create dilemmas for Russia all along its periphery in a bid to have Russia overextended and eventually collapse. They are forcing Russia to make very difficult decisions. We see a decision made recently for Russia to essentially cut Syria loose. It was unable to invest the manpower, material to sustain the Syrian Arab army. The Syrian forces were overwhelmed and the government in Syria has collapsed. We now see US-backed interference in Georgia, US-backed protests violently trying to overthrow the sitting government. And this is what the article is all about. And I'm going to cover this in the article itself, but it's worth repeating over and over again. This Rand Corporation 2019 paper titled Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground. And if we go to the table of contents, and this is by no means an exhaustive list of pressure points the US is applying on Russia, but these are the main pressure points. Measure 1, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. Measure 2, increase support to the Syrian rebels. We can see the end results of these measures: a now large-scale protracted war in Ukraine, the collapse of the Syrian government to US-backed terrorists. We also have promote regime change in Belarus, exploit tensions in the South Caucasus, and that is where Georgia is located on a map. And the paper is going to talk about Georgia specifically, and I will go over those quotes in this article. So let's just begin. As always, I'm going to read this article for people who cannot or do not want to read it, and I will add additional information in when and if necessary. Political unrest continues to erupt in the nation of Georgia along Russia's southern Caucasus border, led by openly anti-Russian protesters backed by US, European government money and support. The protests are a repeat of similar unrest that targeted Georgia in 2003, leading to the overthrow of the elected government then. This is not some Russian claim made baselessly. This is an admission from the collective West itself, from the Western media itself, citing US officials involved in the overthrow of Georgia in 2003 and other nations in the region and around the globe. A 2004 Guardian article. Now, you're very familiar with this article because I've gone over it many times before. 2004 Guardian, US campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. And it goes through the entire process the US uses to overthrow elected governments around the globe, to reverse election results that the US does not like. So the article titled US Campaign Behind the Turmoil in Kiev not only admitted that the unrest in Ukraine that year, in 2004, was fully organized, directed, and backed by the US government, it admitted that similar US-sponsored unrest had, and this is a quote, 4 countries in 4 years, including Georgia itself. The Guardian admitted, funded and organized by the US government, deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, the 2 big American parties, and US non-government organizations. The campaign was first used in Europe in Belgrade, and they have to say first used in Europe because it has been used all around the globe, including in Europe. So first in Belgrade in 2000 to beat Slobodan Milosevic at the ballot box. Richard Miles, the US ambassador in Belgrade, played a key role. And by last year, so 2003, because this article is from 2004, as US ambassador in Tbilisi, he repeated the trick in Georgia, coaching Mikhail Saakashvili in how to bring down Eduard Shevardnadze. The same article explained last year, so again 2003, because the article is from 2004, before becoming president in Georgia, the US-educated Mr. Saakashvili traveled from Tbilisi to Belgrade to be coached in the techniques of mass defiance. Coached by who? By the United States, and this institutionalization of regime change that it uses all around the globe. And from 2003 to 2008, the US installed a client regime headed by Saakashvili, welcomed US NATO military training, equipment, and weapons as part of a de facto NATOization right on Russia's borders, as part of what the US State Department referred to as the Georgia Train and Equip program. And all the links to this will be in the video description below, and they are all included in the article itself if you are reading the article. And this is the US State Department website, archived Georgia Train and Equip program. You see 2003. And so that is what the US was doing. And Russia, seeing this unfolding all along its border, understands that eventually the US wants to use this process on Russia itself. It wants to overthrow the Russian government and then fold it into the European Union and NATO. And of course, do it through coercion and even outright force. This is what Russia is reacting to. This is not Russian aggression. This is not re-emerging Russian imperialism. This is a reaction to US imperialism, US and NATO expansion up to and all along Russia's borders, and attempts to destabilize Russia within its own borders. This training and equipping continued right up to 2008, when Georgian forces attacked Russian peacekeepers in August, precipitating a short but devastating war for Georgia. Earlier that year, for example, Georgian forces switched from Kalashnikovs to US-made M4 carbines, Reuters reported. That is this article right here. Georgian army replaces Kalashnikov with US rifle. When a military switches over from one main infantry weapon to another, it is a major change. It is a change that involves doctrine, logistics, infrastructure, training. It is a serious commitment, and it was a commitment that Georgia was making as part of being integrated into a US-led NATO bloc, even though it still did not officially join NATO, but that was obviously where this was all headed. This reflected the depth of US involvement in building up Georgia's forces ahead of its attack on Russia. So it was not some sort of casual relationship with symbolic training. This was a plan to completely transform Georgia's army into a cudgel to use against neighboring Russia. Despite attempts by the US to depict the August 2008 conflict as a Russian invasion, the European Union, as part of its own investigation, found Georgia to be responsible for triggering the conflict, Reuters would report. So we have this article from The Guardian in 2008. Cheney attacks illegitimate Russian invasion on visit to Georgia. Well, Dick Cheney is actually an expert on invading other countries, but in this case, it's simply propaganda, and even the European Union at the time saw through it. Georgia started war with Russia, EU-backed report, and they talk all about how, despite Georgia's claims on the contrary, they precipitated that conflict, and Russia was within its rights to respond. Of course, the report tries to be balanced and complains about how Russia overreacted. But even the EU is saying that Georgia started the conflict and Russia was in its rights to respond. Now let's talk about this Rand Corporation 2019 paper. And this is not a blueprint that was created and then used. It is a reflection of ongoing plans the US was already in the middle of implementing and had been implementing for years, and the paper is just setting the direction into the future for these already ongoing plans. Georgia's political capture by the US, then use as an armed proxy against neighboring Russia, in a devastating war, served as a template the US would use again, but on a much larger scale in Ukraine from 2014 to present day. And this is a conflict that I have focused on for now going on to 3 years. Georgia is still identified by US government and US arms industry funded policymakers as one of the several possible fronts for continued use to extend Russia. And I just want to show people who is really driving US foreign policy. It's not US President Joe Biden. It is not US President-elect Donald Trump. It is unelected corporate financier interests. They are the ones who fund these think tanks. The think tanks create a consensus. They publish these policy papers. The policy papers are transformed into bills by armies of lawyers. The bills are brought to Washington with lobbyists, and those elected into office in Washington simply rubber stamp these policies. You can see the sponsors, the US government, every section of the US government and military. They have it broken down into various types of clients. We go down to industry, we can see large Fortune 500 corporations, big pharma industry, arms manufacturers. And we can see all of these other organizations created by these corporate interests that the RAND Corporation fits together into. So here again, here's the website where you can download for free this entire paper and read it. In the 2019 RAND Corporation paper titled Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground, Georgia is listed by name under a section titled Measure 4, Exploit Tensions in the South Caucasus. Other measures include provide lethal aid to Ukraine, increase support to the Syrian rebels, promote regime change in Belarus, reduce Russian influence in Central Asia, and challenge Russian presence in Moldova. All 6 measures are being pursued by the US government to one degree or another, especially considering the ongoing war in Ukraine and the recent escalation of conflict in Syria, which has now fully overthrown the Syrian government. And again, people ask themselves, why didn't Russia do something to stop that? Because if they invested in Syria, they would have overextended themselves, just as this strategy intends to do. So Russia is refusing to fall into that trap. It had to make a difficult decision. If it could, it would have saved Syria. It can't. It is not all powerful. There are limits to what Russia can do, and it needs to prioritize. Regarding Georgia specifically, under Measure 4, the report states, the United States could extend Russia in the Caucasus in 2 ways. First, the United States could push for a closer NATO relationship with Georgia and Azerbaijan, likely leading Russia to strengthen its military presence in South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Armenia, and southern Russia. And we can see how Armenia, Azerbaijan, the US has created this horrible conflict there. They have politically captured Armenia, and they have placed this additional pressure on Russia there as well. That is a whole nother topic to discuss. It also notes that the United States might also renew efforts to bring Georgia into NATO. The current ruling party in Georgia seeks to avoid NATO membership, thus avoid becoming the next Ukraine. Look at what is happening to Ukraine. The Georgia Dream Party, in power now in Georgia, as the time I'm recording this, knows that if Georgia continues toward NATO, it will end up like Ukraine. They understand that. In order, and not because it's something in their imagination, it's because the US has already done this to Georgia already. In order to use Georgia as a disposable proxy, the US must remove the current Georgian government from power and reinstall an obedient client regime eager to subordinate Georgia's best interests to Washington's. And it's not just about getting the government to do this, a client regime installed into power. It's also to convince the public that Washington's interests are their best interests, even if in reality it is self-destruction. It is collective national suicide, as is happening in Ukraine at this moment. The same paper warns, however, that Washington fully understands the national security concerns Russia has with NATO troops expanding their presence along its border, including possibly in Georgia, and notes that Russia may militarily intervene to prevent this, just as Russia has now done in Ukraine. And they admit that it would be an absolute disaster for Georgia, but they don't care, because that is the whole point of politically capturing another nation and using it as a proxy. They take the full brunt of the consequences, and you reap any benefits. The same 2019 paper wrote under Measure 1, Provide Lethal Aid to Ukraine, that the resulting conflict would likely, and this is a quote, a direct quote from the paper, produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace. All realities now taking shape. They knew that taking control of Ukraine and transforming it into a battering ram against Russia would destroy Ukraine. It could overextend Russia. It could damage American credibility, but ultimately it would be Ukraine first and foremost suffering the full brunt, the majority of the consequences. This is what makes Georgia a battleground between American primacy and the primacy of national sovereignty, the right of a nation to have its own foreign policy, reflecting its own best interests, rather than being coerced into serving America's interests at its own expense. The US government employs polling agencies to assess and present public opinion within targeted nations, including Georgia, to global audiences, depicting aspirations to join the European Union, NATO, and even position themselves adversarially against Russia as the will of the people and representing what is supposedly in their best interest. We see the US do this all the time, and you hear people argue this all the time. There was a poll, and everyone in Taiwan wants independence from China. There was a poll, and Georgia wants to join NATO. So are you saying we should ignore the people's will? And my argument to that is, with enough money and time, you can convince people of literally anything, including collective national suicide, as the US has done in Ukraine. We can all agree objectively that what the US coerced and convinced the people in Ukraine to do is definitely not in their best interest. And they admit it in this paper. They admit that the path they put Ukraine on was definitively, objectively, not reflecting Ukraine's best interest, but their job and the role of US interference is to convince these people otherwise. So let's continue. Many onlookers take these polling numbers as evidence that sitting governments opposed to such interests are dictatorships running roughshod over the public's will. In reality, these polls are not assessing the best interests of the Georgian public, but instead the success or failure of US government-funded propaganda campaigns aimed at convincing the Georgian public Washington's interests are also their interests. Objectively, neutrality for nations like Georgia or Ukraine or pretty much any other country caught in the middle here represents the Georgian people's best interests, especially considering its most important trade partners and the consequences already suffered by Georgia during its previous political capture and use by Washington. I want to show you this. Is the Harvard University Atlas of Economic Complexity. They kind of changed the format a little bit, but I think you still get the idea. They're talking about exports from Georgia. And you can see how Georgia is primarily exporting to its regional neighbors, Turkey, Russia, Bulgaria. The United States is this little tiny red rectangle all the way in the corner. The collective West essentially is all the way in the corner because they represent the smallest export markets for Georgia. So by far, the stability of the Caucasus region and its relationship with Russia is by far more important to cultivate and preserve if we are objectively assessing Georgia's best interests. What about imports? Again, here's the United States all the way in the corner, representing the smallest percentages. It's Turkey, it is China, it is Russia, Germany, but half of what is imported from Russia, Azerbaijan. So again, you're aligning Georgia to the United States and Western Europe when its most important trade partners for exports and imports are outside of the collective West, and the collective West is opposed to these nations. So you're asking Georgia to realign against its best interests economically. You're also asking them to become adversarial with these nations it actually trades with the most. And you are creating a potential crisis that could destabilize or even destroy the nation in war. And the US has already done this from 2003 to 2008. So it is not as if the Georgia Dream Party is imagining this. They have already gone through this once already, relatively recently. While nations around the globe have invested heavily in national defense across traditional domains like land borders, shores, and airspace, few nations have recognized, let alone properly defended, new domains, including information space. The US wages multi-domain warfare across. US political interference can be understood as a non-military instrument in persuasive, inducement, and coercive strategies along a single spectrum that on the other end includes military instruments of persuasive, inducement, and coercive strategies. So US meddling, US propaganda is just the first couple of steps toward what will eventually, if it is deemed necessary, becomes US military intervention, either through US-sponsored terrorism, proxy war, or actual US-led war and occupation. Actually, I go ahead and I say that here. In other words, US interference is just the first few steps of a process that eventually includes sanctions, US-sponsored sedition, terrorism, proxy war, and even US invasion and occupation, all of it aimed at politically capturing and controlling a targeted nation. Libya and Syria serve as examples, first targeted by US political interference that steadily grew into state-sponsored violence, to proxy war, and eventually direct US military intervention. We can see how Libya and now Syria have been completely destroyed as functioning nation states by this process. In both Libya and Syria, for years and years, the US interfered, attempted to influence Libyan and Syrian society. They created these fake NGOs funded by the US government, meant to invasively manipulate public opinion and poison the people in these countries against their own best interests, to divide them against one another, and to create the conditions that would make US regime change more likely to succeed. The limits to Washington's ability to move along this spectrum, from political interference all the way to US military occupation and the end goal of political capture, are the measures a targeted nation has put in place to deter each step from being taken. A nation with a large military and a tightly controlled information space makes US persuasion, inducement, and coercion strategies of any kind more difficult. And we can see this in Russia and China. They have massive militaries backed with a nuclear arsenal, and they also tightly control their information space. They do not allow the United States to infiltrate and control their information space, their educational system, and therefore their political system is free of US interference. Nations with powerful militaries, but no control over their own information space in the 21st century, are much like nations last century, with powerful land armies, but no air force or air defenses. Air power allowed the US to attack targeted nations all throughout the 20th century with absolute impunity, creating conditions both militarily and economically conducive to eventual regime change. Today, by compromising a targeted nation's information space, controlling what information can and cannot be shared, the US is able to turn a nation's population against its own institutions without Washington itself firing a single shot. While it takes much longer and often goes unseen by ordinary onlookers, the final result is success as resounding as any traditional military conquest. Again, just look at Libya, now go look at Syria. This is the end result of failing to protect your information space, keeping US manipulation and influence outside of your borders and outside of your information domain as well as your physical domain. The overthrow of Georgia's government in 2003 and Ukraine's government in 2014 are just two of many examples. So those are two additional examples in addition to Libya and Syria. Georgia's recent passing of its foreign agents law represented a tentative first step towards securing its information space from the deep and disruptive interference exercised by the US through local fronts funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, and adjacent organizations. There are adjacent US government funded organizations. There are also corporate funded foundations that work hand in hand with the NED in the US State Department, including George Soros's Open Society. But there are many, many others, and they are creating more because they understand many people are starting to wake up to this. So they're trying to launder the money through many additional steps that obfuscate the actual source of the funding, the actual source of the agenda, which is the unelected special interest in the US who control and drive the US government. I often talk about how US military and industrial power is in terminal decline, but the United States still possesses a super weapon, and it is this ability to infiltrate a country's information space, infiltrate its education system, politically capture its political system, and then use that nation to advance its own interests, often at the expense of that nation's interests and even its existence. The NED funds programs targeting Georgia's information space by standing up media organizations promoting US interests, including Georgia's joining of both the EU and NATO. This does not serve, objectively, this does not serve Georgia's best interests. It only serves America's interests, and it does it at the expense of Georgia, even if the US is successful in convincing the Georgian people otherwise. These media platforms also repeat US narratives regarding US adversaries, including Russia and China, in an attempt to poison the Georgian population against who would otherwise be constructive partners for Georgia's future. I even showed you the economic trade Georgia conducts with these nations the US is poisoning them against. An example of this is Open Caucuses, OC. This is their Who We Are webpage. They're here begging you for money, and they beg you for money on every page. And this is something all NED funded, US government NED funded fronts do. They beg you for money, even though they're already being funded by the largest, most powerful governments and economies on planet Earth today. And that includes the National Endowment for Democracy. And I already told you about Open Society. They also have the European Endowment for Democracy, no points for originality. The UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, that is the British government, also funding them. And you can see all of these other smaller, less obvious contributors who simply serve as intermediaries US launders money and support through. And also the US Embassy in Tbilisi, Georgia itself. So that is Open Caucuses. It is just US government funded propaganda. So at the time of writing, or at the time of recording, this is what their homepage looks like. Georgia Live updates. Protests continue after halting of EU accession bid. And you can read this. It is completely biased in favor of the protesters and their US European backers. They have articles like this. After a month of simmering protests, Georgia erupted. Why now? And they're explaining to you why this has happened, and they do it, and they explain it in every detail except mentioning the US government money behind it. And they have articles like this, or well, it's an editorial. Georgia's rigged election. So of course it has to be rigged because there was an outcome the US finds unfavorable. So of course it had to be rigged. It couldn't just be that their efforts to influence and manipulate the Georgian population has so far failed, or is failing at the moment. US government-funded media outlets like OC are numerous, well-funded, and often monopolize the information space in targeted nations like Georgia. I am in Southeast Asia, in the Kingdom of Thailand. US and European-funded media outlets, or outlets that are influenced by Western narratives, absolutely monopolize Thailand's information space to the detriment of Thailand's objective best interests. So this is a global problem. This is because many nations also rely on, so why? Why is Georgia's information space monopolized by the US? Why is Thailand's information space monopolized by the US? This is because many nations also rely on US-based social media platforms like Facebook and search engines like Google to find and share information. These US-based platforms work directly with the US State Department, determining what information can and cannot be shared, what information is promoted across the public, creating the illusion of overwhelming consensus while simultaneously suppressing alternative views. And even X, even though it has by far improved upon becoming X from having been Twitter, is still literally owned by a man who is now working directly within the US government. This is a huge national security problem for the rest of the world. If your information space is controlled by social media platforms based in the US and connected directly to the US government, that is a national security threat. The flow of information in your country is at the mercy of the United States government. US government-funded programs also target the education systems of other nations from elementary school to university, and we saw the opposition calling on elementary school students, high school students, to come out into the streets and protest, knowing that it's dangerous, that children will be hurt, and they were cynically planning on exploiting that violence and those injuries, those predicted, desired injuries. They were going to use that to escalate the conflict even further in Georgia. They have done the exact same thing here in Thailand. They do this everywhere. It is one playbook by one single circle of interests in the United States. So these US government-funded programs targeting these education systems in targeted nations shape young minds in what to think long before they understand how to think. Students then see narratives promoted through these programs reinforced across the US-dominated media, shaping national opinion and even national identity. So there are synergies between these different means of US interference inside a single targeted country. The US, through the US State Department and NED, created entire pipelines indoctrinating youths who eventually worked their way into a targeted nation's legal, educational, journalistic, and political system. Aspiring lawyers, educators, leaders, diplomats, and journalists, also even business people, are deliberately plugged into professional and personal networks across the collective West through these scholarships and exchange programs, ensuring the vast majority of those indoctrinated into these programs not only serve US interests, but face professional and personal isolation if they don't. So they go on these internships, exchange programs, scholarships to the United States, to Europe, and they are deliberately connected into these political and professional networks in the collective West. When they go back to their home country, they remain in touch and connected to those networks. And if they start thinking on their own or contradicting Western narratives, that network is going to pressure them to stay in line. And if they don't, they will be ostracized. And this is a huge threat to their ego, their self-esteem, and you will be surprised how effective this is in actually keeping them in line. Their sense of worth and value as a human being, the importance they feel by having been selected in the first place, they want to maintain that, and they will choose that over the truth almost every single time, with very few exceptions. And this is how imperialism has controlled people and nations for centuries, throughout human history, really, since imperialism began. Together, these invasive means of political interference and capture represent a superweapon few nations acknowledge, let alone defend against. Nations like Russia and China have done much to secure their respective information spaces, as well as their educational, legal, and political systems from such interference. Russia and China have pipelines where they take young people and they train them into being journalists that then do their job reflecting the best interests of their own country, not the collective West. They have similar programs to create diplomats, leadership, to serve in leadership roles. None of these people are going off to the United States, being indoctrinated, and then being integrated into the highest levels of power back in Russia or China. That is not happening. Why would you ever do that if you are trying to actually serve the best interests of your country and recognize and defend national security? However, Russia and China's ability to assist allies in doing likewise is so far very limited. Georgia's ongoing fight against Washington's attempts to reassert political control over the nation and redirect it onto a path of self-destruction represents a national security threat not only to Georgia itself, but to the rest of the multipolar world. We can see the domino effect something like the political capture and collapse of Syria has. We saw it in 2011 in Libya. It became a breeding ground for NATO-sponsored terrorism, which spread across first North Africa and then the rest of Africa, and then even beyond that. And so this is what will happen in Syria, and if Georgia collapses, it will happen in Georgia as well. There is an effect that goes far beyond just the collapse of any one particular targeted nation. If Georgia can be politically captured, its population poisoned against its own best interests, again, and convinced to destroy their own nation in conflict with Washington's chief adversaries, any other nation can be targeted next and will be targeted next. And every single success the US has makes them more powerful and more likely to succeed the next time. More must be done across the multipolar world to expose Washington's regime change superweapon, promote the means by which to defend against it, including foreign agent laws, cutting off NED and adjacent foundation funding, and the creation of pipelines creating future political leaders, diplomats, business owners, and journalists who serve the best interests of their own nations, not Washington's, and the creation of social media platforms within and between nations of the multipolar world beyond Washington's control. Because while China and Russia have their own indigenous social media platforms where people within the country share information according to how Russia and China want that information to be shared, there really is no way to use those social media platforms to reach the rest of the world. Right now, the multipolar world still depends entirely on US-based social media platforms to share information with the rest of the world. The multipolar world needs their own international social media platforms that are beyond the reach and control of the United States government and the unelected corporate financier special interests that drive its foreign policy. Assistance could be provided by Russia and China to defend a nation's information space, just as Russia and China sell military weapons to defend a nation's traditional domains like air, land, and sea. So Russia is selling tanks and warplanes and naval vessels. They can also sell social media platforms that can be built up within a nation and then used to exchange information within it, and then also between other multipolar nations, eventually displacing or removing US-based social media platforms from their information space so that they can control how information flows, not Washington, not Wall Street. Today it is Georgia. Tomorrow, as the US has proven over and over and over again across many decades, and as it has proven through its long and ever-growing list of nations it has divided and destroyed through US interference, most recently Syria, it could be any other nation next. And the problem that I see is that in many targeted nations, Thailand included, people in positions of power and influence for some reason think they're the exception. They have a special relationship with the United States. The US wouldn't do that to them. Yes, they're interfering, but it'll never get out of control. If the US is interfering in your country, their goal is to eventually create a parallel system that eventually displaces the indigenous system. They are going to politically capture your country. They want to convince you that that's not what is happening so that you don't stop them until it's too late. When you finally realize that, no, you're not an exception. Yes, they are going to politically capture your country as well. By the time you realize that, usually it's far too late, as was the case in Libya, Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, far too late. And then it runs out of control. You can delay it through waging war. Sometimes you can successfully stave it off at tremendous cost, but ultimately it's too late and you pay a much higher cost than if you just accepted some discomfort confronting the US in the beginning and just uprooting all of their influence as Russia and China have, as other nations are beginning to do. So I hope that the chaos in Georgia, the collapse of Syria, and the very, very long list of nations the US has infected and destroyed through this process of political capture, I hope that it's a wake-up call. I hope that the multipolar world, BRICS, ASEAN, I hope they start thinking about the collective defense of information space, the national defense of information space, the creation of not just alternative financial systems, which we see taking place, alternative diplomatic forums, which is already taking place, but also alternative spaces for information to flow between nations and within nations, out of the reach of Washington, beyond the influence of Washington. I really hope this becomes a top priority, because again, many nations feel like their narrative is more compelling than America's. Objectively, that is true. Unfortunately, the average human being is not going to rationally consider both narratives. They are going to depend mostly on their emotions and their short-term self-serving interests. And the United States always provides a more appealing narrative in that case. If you suspend logic, reason, and research, you will always pick America's narrative over any other narrative, no matter how self-destructive it is in reality. We've seen this over and over again. The only way to prevent people from falling into this trap is to make sure the US isn't infecting your information space in the first place. That's the only way to do it. It's the only success we have ever seen is in nations like Russia and China, who have just completely removed US influence from their information space. So this needs to be focused on and made a priority. And I can only hope that I will continue doing what I can to promote this. I just hope more people listen. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check out the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos go up on YouTube, Rumble. I also am now posting videos, entire videos on X, on YouTube. I have over 900 videos. Go to the search option here under the video tab, type in any topic, and you will find a video that I have done on that topic. In case you're wondering about a topic that I've not covered recently, or you're wondering what I have said about something maybe a year or two ago, please use that search option. I also have a blog that I have maintained since 2010. It has thousands, literally thousands of articles that I've written over the last 10 plus years. It is landdestroyer.blogspot.com. The link is in the video description below. And again, there is a search function here. You can search through over a decade of articles that I have written about virtually every topic related to geopolitics. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who is helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, it is all greatly appreciated. And even if you have no additional resources to spare and you're just helping share my work with others, getting the word out there, that is also greatly appreciated. I could not do this work without that support. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.